Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Reflections of the Father's Heart. I have a very special guest today. This guest I've actually known for a few years, and we've kind of stayed in touch because he's so amazing and so fun and has such a light for life. So this is AmarAtma. Now, AmarAtma is a trained grief recovery method specialist, but he's also a board certified chaplain. He's got a degree in ministry. He has a master's in traditional Chinese medicine. He's done a lot of really cool things. And so I just want to welcome you. I'm so glad you're here.
Oh my God, Sandy, I'm so grateful that you've invited me. I'm so excited for this conversation. And I have to say to your listeners that Sandy is not just a friend and a colleague, but she's been a mentor of mine. She was part of my grief recovery training, and I took mentorship from her when I was starting my practice and just getting insights when I've done retreats or curriculum development and online courses. Sandy's been like an amazing soundboard for me just to like nuance and like tease out important things because she's an amazing educator. And so, Sandy, thank you.
It's so wonderful. I just love spending time with you. Well, and believe me, that was an honor because I feel like you're somebody that just gets so much inspiration and you just take it and you run with it.
Yeah.
So let's start. Tell us a little bit about you, about like where you live, what you do now, and kind of how you got there.
Yeah. So my story is kind of an unfolding journey, really specifically around grief and grief work. And you know that obviously because of our work in the grief recovery method. But in outside of that, I found that like grief hit me at a really young age.
Mm.
And I didn't know that it was grief. Like nobody said the word grief. Nobody talked about like grief and loss. And so I realized that I had like massive tangible losses and intangible losses that I was experiencing at a young age. And it took me until I was about 20 years old in a really dark place, like super
Mm.
dark, that I really needed something of life to then continue to live. Like it was pretty intense, dark night of the soul realities. And so when I realized that my pain was not like a depression or some personality thing, this mental health or diagnosis reality, but it was really in this emotional, spiritual injury experience around grief and loss, I started to somehow feel like, oh, that's what it is? Like, that's what it is, really? And I had something finally I could name. And in naming it, like relief started to happen right away. But then I was like, what do I do with this? Like, where do I go with this?
Mm.
And I've always been that kind of like guy, like kind of rare, but like emotionally heart centered based from a really young age. So I was like one of the sensitives, like highly sensitive people, empathic. So I was the one who did like peer counseling in high school. I studied nonviolent communication. I was big on like mediation and just like wanting to counsel people. And then my undergraduate degree was a degree that I created in spiritual psychology or transpersonal psychology with the emphasis around mysticism and spirituality. And so I found myself kind of leaning into this spiritually oriented, emotionally centric world. And grief became like my way of trying to figure out my like professional education became my way of trying to figure out grief and the spirituality around grief. Took me to Chinese medicine where I studied acupuncture. I was in school for a long time. That was a 4.5 year clinical degree. I worked with a lot of people. I learned a lot of amazing skills before trauma and safety and conversations around the nervous system were really popular. I was doing a lot of deep work with people and really specialized techniques. And while at the same time of doing my Chinese medical degree, I was apprenticing with one of my spiritual mentors in my ministry education, which was a meditative focused ministry. So it was like deeply interpersonal, self inquiry, contemplative based. It was very structured as a seek my faith in that way, but also in much more of a universal consciousness and humanitarian based focus. And so my world for this solid amount of 10 years was like really deeply introspective. And through my acupuncture practice, after getting board certified and licensed, I was feeling very undersatisfied with it. So I decided to merge my ministry and medicine degree and went into chaplaincy and then worked in hospitals. And that was working in acute care level 1 trauma university hospital in downtown Phoenix. And I did my residency in CPE, if people know what that is, clinical pastoral education. And it turned out to being that I worked there full time for 5, 6+ years. I worked in the Phoenix Children's Hospital for a little while, and I worked in, the ICUs. I worked in the pediatric side. I worked on the adult side. I worked in the trauma base. I worked in palliative care. I worked in inpatient psych, which was a really blessing for me, just because of my upbringing, and just like really, really powerful experiences around end of life care. So I say that grief work found me. I didn't find it. It like tapped me. And then through my process of my unfolding, I realized that we have a lot of misinformation around grief, and we have, and not just grief, but emotional processing, like emotional healing. Like grief is of the utmost emotional experience, but we have a lot of emotional experiences that are not grief oriented. Like I kind of disagree with that, because I think grief underlies everything. Like loss is like everywhere.
Yeah.
And so whenever we have a pain or a trauma, I can like identify a loss that's underneath that. It's like the linchpin. And so I fought doing grief work for a long time, to be honest. I was like, I don't want to create a life that's going to be heavy and dark and all that, and so you and I have had these conversations of the
Yeah.
unfolding, and I just realized that no, like grief underlies so many things. And I said, I can't fight this. I gotta like receive the gift of it. And then I realized that it's not really about doom, gloom, despair. Like that's not what grief work really is. Grief work is actually about joy. It's actually about love. Grief work is actually about what matters most. It's about self actualization. It's about how to live our best life. It's about how to really recognize when we've had massive losses in our life, that we start to reclaim things and be like, oh, wow, like life's really important. Life's precious. Things are precious. People are precious. Moments are precious. And we want to learn how to own that. And so, from my background in Chinese medicine, teaching yoga and meditation for a long time, and mindfulness based training, my chaplaincy experience, I've really created like a curriculum of how to use mind, body, spirit oriented medicine to work with grief in a multifaceted way. That's not just about feeling better, but it being a portal towards something really majestic and regal about our humanness that we could lean into. And that is who I am as a person and the work I do.
So beautifully said. And there were so many things I was like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. So, one of the things that you said just kind of even early on about when you recognize that you'd had tangible and intangible losses as a child, I think
Yeah.
that one is so important, because I think a lot of people skip over loss, and
Yes.
they skip over this idea, or just don't understand this idea
Right.
of tangible and intangible. So, tangible just means it's a person, but intangible can be so many different things.
That's right. That's right. I call these invisible losses. Yeah, invisible losses. They're like the losses that we don't even think that they're a loss. These are like moves as a child. These are like the divorce that happens. These are like the friendships we've lost. These are like, you know, I mean, there's so many different types. And I know that grief recovery names 40 odd types of losses. I feel like there's hundreds of types of losses that are
Yeah.
there. So for me, what I had experienced was really my major forms of grief started with my grandfather's death when I was about 12 years old. And if you know anything about South Asian or Indian community, generational families, like we lived together. And he was my pillar. Like
Mm,
I wasn't alone because he existed.
mm,
And I realized that some of my biggest losses, or like how my unfolding of loss journey really started with him. So he was a very powerful, tangible loss. But at a young age, I experienced a lot of earthquakes, my father traveling, being at the hospital for my other grandparents, wild illnesses that were taking place. I grew up with a ton of anticipatory grief. And I had a relationship to anxious attachment, which meant that I had a difficult time building attachments with people because I was scared that they were going to die and going to go. And I was like, why build relationships with people if they were going to go?
Yep.
So when I moved a ton or when I lost friendships, these were losses that were really big for me. I was bullied a ton.
Mm.
And so I had a lot of loss of innocence and a lot of loss of self-worth. And I had a lot of like loss of identity components. I grew up in a like Orange County, Southern California, non-diverse experience. I was an immigrant. I was a first generation Indian American growing up. I'm a Sikh. I wore my hair up. I looked differently. And so I had like my cultural family stuff at home and then this American lifestyle. So I had this like split reality culturally. So when my grandfather died, it was a nearby that time that I had first time cut my hair, which meant that I was cutting away a cultural identity from me.
Mm.
So these were like the powerful forms of losses. You know, I felt a loss of stability, a loss of safety, a loss of security with all the moves and with all the, like lack of self worth and bullying that I experienced. And so with that turned me into a really chaotic place. And it didn't really make sense that I was like, oh, my grandfather died. Okay, well, he was old, but my dad went into a deep depression. We had to move from that house because that house reminded too much of my grandfather for him. And so, that was like something never spoken about or never talked about. And so these were like experiences that I was feeling. And then, there's intergenerational grief and, feeling the grief of my family, the things that they couldn't process. I didn't know how to process it. So my grief became somatic expressions of grief. I had digestive pain. I couldn't eat food. Eating was really difficult for me because it caused a lot of pain. I had disenfranchised grief and I had ambiguous grief. So not only are there like several invisible losses, intangible and tangible ones, but there's different types of grief and how grief manifests in our being because it's not always the same for each of us. And so grief manifests in different types of ways. So I was hit with a lot of somatic type of grief, which is why I do a lot of somatic grief work. I do a lot of work with somatic practices to help the body grieve. And so it's a big part of my work because that's how I experienced life.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that too, even, and I can relate to you when you even said about being sensitive. In other words, you're already empathic and tuned in and picking things up. And I think when you're like that as a child and that's happening, there's losses, like you said, that come with that because you're also picking up on what everybody else isn't processing too.
Truth.
And I feel like that isn't even talked about enough, like for kids that grow up that way or people that tend to be more sensitive to their environment.
Yeah.
You end up, because you're not taught what to do with your emotions, you end up just taking everybody else's on. And
Yeah.
now you've got like all of yours and everybody else's. And then, yeah, it's coming out in all these different ways.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we grow up in families where there isn't an understood expression of, like you said, emotions, it all becomes grief, right? It all becomes this, oh, it's all stored, right? We go
Mm-hmm.
from being an emotional processing plant to an emotional storage unit because
Oh,
we're storing everything inside.
so good.
And we were not meant to do that. Like we were not
No,
designed to store emotions inside. We were not.
no. And the body, we know from Bessel van der Kolk's work, the body does keep the score.
Guys.
And, from the Chinese medical perspective, we not only digest food, but we digest life. And, when we talk about grief, then the very close thing is about how to let go and how to move on. Well, if we're talking about digesting life and digesting emotions and digesting loss and grief, elimination is the last part of a digestive process. There's an aspect of being able to assimilate and absorb and integrate the life experiences of that. And I didn't have that. And so often the time when we are experiencing what I call the grieving body, how grief impacts our body, there's a lot of immune system factors, white blood cells, inflammatory markers that are activated. And a lot of those activations lead into a digestive response as well.
Mhm.
So there's an indigestion or an IBS or autoimmune system issues because we know that the gut health is actually our immune health, and there's a gut brain axis to a lot of these components. So our mood, serotonin is developed in the gut as well. So like our mood and how we experience pleasure are really foundational to the microbiome. And so recognizing that the microbiome and the digestive system is not solely a physiological, but also an emotional and spiritual and mental experience as well. That when we suppress emotions and we hold them and we bury them in our body, we are burying those emotions alive. And they become like landmines in which we experience them. So now we have emotional indigestion or emotional constipation, which is then affecting the cascade of our immune system and inflammatory processes through our body. I literally experienced this for 20 plus years of my life. Like I had to work so hard to unlearn and relearn how to be a human, like a healthy, vital human being, which was about emotional centricity. And because I didn't learn, I developed that fawn response, that people pleasing, sponge like empathy kind of experience. So I was performative in a lot of ways to try to get love from people because I was experiencing so much loneliness because I was processing everybody else's emotions that they weren't doing. And by taking that on, I became profoundly disconnected from myself. And thus, in my disconnectedness, I felt that the only way that I could receive love was to people please, which meant to psychically, energetically go into their reality, know what it is that they love, they want, and to figure that out, give them what they need, anticipate their needs. And in doing so, further perpetuate a loss of self in that reality. In doing so, the process of my grief journey is multifaceted that way. I had to reclaim self. I had to reclaim innocence. I had to do some inner child work to really find those foundations of my ego identity, my strength hold. And in doing so, digest life, digest those emotions, and come to a healthy form of immunity. And that's energetic immunity. That means strong boundaries. That means knowing thyself. That means not people pleasing, right? Like, so it's so like multi layered, but that's what I love about grief work because it's like, it's underlying to all these mechanisms that we have around how we support. But it's very true. It's all the things.
Oh, again, so beautifully said, because going back to what you were even saying about, digestion, I loved that correlation. I am
Yeah.
very similar to you, had a lot of loss experiences as a child. A lot of them were also considered traumatizing. And yet, even though I had done a lot of different things and a lot of like trauma work and things like that, it's when I actually did the grief work and started
Yeah.
getting those emotions out
Yeah.
and completed
Yeah.
that my digestion actually started to open up and it
Yes.
started to flow again,
Yes.
because it was all just held inside and it was
Yes.
all held in the body.
Yeah.
So,
Sometimes, grief and trauma are like sister experiences
yes.
because when there's a trauma, there's automatically going to be a loss as well.
Yep.
And so we have to recognize that trauma comes with grief, but not always grief comes with trauma. And so some griefs are not a trauma experience, it's just an experience of grief. But because emotions are not really well understood, we don't know how to really process them in our culture and our society. We don't really have the mind body understanding about how emotions live in the body, not just in the mind, not just in the heart. They're not just this amorphous experience that's abstract. They're very tangible, they're very real, they're very sensationally based. Emotions are like, when emotions come up and big feelings come up, it could be like survival mechanisms, like a trauma response, like a trigger comes up when these big feelings come in. And so when it works, when there's trauma connected with grief, we have to really develop safety in the nervous system.
Yeah.
There has to be that polyvagal, ventral vagal, kind of understanding of like, okay, this is all about being in the here and now. We're safe. We're okay. And so you're totally right. But then at the same point, once we develop that comfortability and safety, and we're not as triggered by emotional experiences, that amygdala is not as firing, our prefrontal cortex is not as hijacked, our limbic system is able to feel in harmony with the neuroglandular experiences, right? This mind body continuum. Then we can actually develop the emotional buoyancy and emotional safety to do grief work. You're totally right about that. And so, with all this reality around trauma in our world, and I'm like, nobody's talking about grief. Don't we know that grief is like the next step in the journey? Like, I hate to say it, like once you get through your trauma, it's like, are you better? Yes. And there's some components around the loss that we need to digest so that we can be in our vitalization, like be vital, be in aliveness, be in joy that we are really seeking. But safety is extraordinarily important. Physiological, co-regulatory safety is so fundamental to this.
It is so fundamental, going back to what you were saying, even about the nervous system and, having your limbic system come to
Yes.
safety, right? Like there's a part in the limbic system and it's the amygdala that monitors safety. And so
Yes.
when we're in that response where, like you said, there's a trigger, we're activated, we're in like freeze, fight, flight, or fawn response.
Yes.
Sometimes we can even get stuck there. And so
Yes.
we've somehow got to get registered, oh, safety. And then
Yes.
once we're through that kind of survival,
Yeah.
right, aspect,
Yeah.
now, like you said, okay, now we can process those emotions.
That's
Now
right.
we can now safely release what's being stored emotionally in the body. And if we
Yes.
miss that,
Yes.
then I find that people are kind of stuck in these survival cycles, I like to call them,
Yes. Good
where
call.
maybe
Yeah.
they've come out of the survival, but then one thing happens, they're right back in it. One thing happens,
Truth.
they're right back in it. And they're having a hard time navigating life.
Oh, it's so true, in that way, because, we know, you and I both know grief is cumulative. And
Yeah.
so, we're having these active grief experiences living inside our body
Mm.
without us really knowing. And because we have a very suppression focused coping mechanism of our world, I named 10 different types of suppression for my clients that I work with to help differentiate and decipher between the different mechanisms that we might do, these survival strategies that we might incorporate. But what I find is that when the next loss happens, it's rarely the one loss we are experiencing. Grief has that opportunistic experience. It doesn't want to sit in our heart. Grief is a part of life. It's like this guarantee of our existence, just like life and love and joy and friendships and all that. We say that death and taxes are our two guarantees of life. Grief and loss are also guarantees. And
Yes.
so if grief and loss is part of our evolutionary biology around our spiritual makeup as human beings, right? This construct of this whole being experience, then grief isn't something that's wrong. It's something that's kind of right. And what's right with grief? Then we try to transform grief into love. And grief is a proportional experience to love. Sometimes we say that grief is love that has nowhere to go. And I like that because it reframes grief as a loving thing. If love is complex, it's full and it's dynamic and it's messy, then grief is going to be full and dynamic and messy. If it takes our whole heart to love, it's going to take our whole heart to grieve.
Yeah.
And in that experience of when the next loss comes, that grief that we've been holding inside, that love that we have been holding inside, that unprocessed grief, that unprocessed love is seeking somewhere to go as well. And so then it all comes out. And I think that's what I'm finding is I think that I started to see that if I really feel like we're trying to create world peace, which is an obvious, ambitious goal of mine, you know, then I recognize that world peace comes through inner peace. And inner peace comes from a quote that I love by Rumi. Seek not for love. Seek instead all the barriers you've created against it. I love this
I do too.
because love is an underlying of our experience, but we've created a lot of barriers to love at a rich level. And I feel that inner peace comes from love that exists. It's like a foundational love. It's like a spiritual love. It's like an unconditional love. It's a love that is beyond really words. It's a feeling and an experience. And so seek not for love, but seek the barriers we've created against it. Seek not for peace. Seek the barriers we've created against it. And so then I was like, oh, that's the unresolved grief. If we can work on the barriers we've created against peace, then world peace can happen through inner peace. And that becomes an individual, personal responsibility and accountability piece here. And so, yes, grief is cumulative in that way. Let's not just focus on the traumas, but the emotional digesting that comes through grief work so that we can have that peace and have that love at the richest levels in which we are intended to feel based on our evolutionary spiritual bioenergetics.
I as you're talking, I was just being reminded of something because as I've delved into this more and more and more, I really see grief also as it's a gift. The act of grieving and learning to grieve in real time is really a gift. And I remember I spoke with someone a while back, and they had done this whole thesis, right? And they did it on a biblical, right? Like, so they were looking at the Bible and they were like, what does the Bible say about grief? And the boiler transformative. So what grief does is it takes what's happened, the biggest of loss, the darkest of things, and it transforms it, right? The process of grieving transforms it
Yes.
into hope,
Yes.
character,
Yes.
purpose,
Yes.
life.
Yes.
And so many times I find that people are so adverse to this whole idea of grief and grieving, and they miss it.
Oh yeah.
They miss it
Yeah.
because, to your point, right? Like, we could be carrying all this unresolved grief, and now we're just going to keep stuffing. It's just going to keep accumulating.
Right.
But then, even when we walk through it, now we need to grab onto the very real aspect of, now when something happens in real time, I need to actively grieve. I need to actively walk through it
Yes.
so that it doesn't just become another experience to be suppressed. Because I
Yeah.
love what you said. Grief and loss are part of life. They are.
Yeah. Yeah. And we want to do that with so much compassion and
Yeah.
love and tenderness.
Yeah.
And we want to be conscious of these platitudes and these one liners and these fix-its to grief. I like Mega Divine's work, How to Carry What Can't Be Fixed.
Mm.
Like it's so beautiful. Or Joanne Cacciatore, I think she refers to herself as the grief doctor, and she talks about bearing the unbearable, and there's something just so beautifully and poetic about that experience. I'm really in awe of this conversation, to be honest, because what I hear happening, and I hope the listeners can receive it, is that there's a real invitation here that,
Yeah.
to reframe grief as being a problem or an enemy or something we have to beat away, or this boogeyman kind of experience, but an invitation. And there's not a right way or a wrong way to grieve, but there's this ways in which we have culturally in society made grief out to being something very problematic or diagnostic that needs treatment and assessments and so forth, and not this loving tenderness and spaciousness to allow it to breathe. A part of my work that I like to call is face, embrace, release. Yeah, face, embrace, release. If we think of the fear response that we have, the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, this is the fifth F of that context, is facing it and creating a spaciousness to it. And then instead of using the word like accept, like the 5 stages of grief, if I could just get to acceptance, like I'll have that sense of peace. Like if
Wow.
I could just accept that this is what's happened. Oh, I feel like that's such a resigning experience. It's such an intellectual, gymnastics that we're trying to get to, a shortcut or some sort of finish line of a false sense of peace. But if we can use the word embrace, recognizing that this is a part of life, a natural and normal experience to our human growth, our human evolution, then something really transformative, as you said, alchemical, can take place. And there is a richness that I feel through it. I felt it in my life, actually. In some ways, can I say, I'm like grateful for the shitty things that have happened, like the bullying that I went through, like the moves, the intergenerational trauma, the like my family and not processing their stuff, the like drugs and alcohol that I like went into, the like escapism and self-harm that was a part of my life. Can I say that like I'm grateful for my grief? Well, I think I can, because I've obviously been able to utilize my personal life experience to create transformative experience for others. That if it was purely an intellectual, theological, academic study of my own, ugh. Like how much bypassing would come from that? No
Oh,
empathy, no
yes.
compassion,
Yes.
right? So in some ways, I think you and I maybe share this experience that our pain from our past is not really about us. It was almost like a journey we had to go through to then do our work, like a wounded healer's journey. It's not as
Yeah.
personal. I took it so personally,
Yeah.
but there may be an impersonal kind of component to it. I imagine many of your listeners have gone through things in their life and like, why did I have to go through this? Why did I have to face this? Why do I have to toil? Why do I have to do the work to transform it? There might be actually a powerful purpose behind it and in and of itself. And I have definitely excavated for the purpose through my pain.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because I feel like without, because grieving is such a big part of, there's a healing aspect. But like you said, I love that differentiation between I'm just trying to get to acceptance versus I'm facing, embracing, and I'm releasing,
Yeah.
which is where the power really comes in. And that's
Yeah.
where the transformation really happens.
Yeah.
And it's not easy, but I always say to people, carrying all that stuff around with you is not easy either. I paid a lot
Right.
of prices for the stuff I was carrying.
Truth.
And, and yes, it was really hard to face it. And there were times when I, of course, had, like you said, those moments of like, I can't believe that I'm the one that has to face this. But the other side, to wake
Yeah.
up in the morning and go, I feel so peaceful when I wake up, or I feel so
Yeah.
happy, or I'm excited about today, or
Yeah.
oh man, there's this thing going on. I'm going to really need to process it. But that's my reality
Yeah.
versus I wake up in the morning and if I get a text message, I'm literally going to lose it because I'm so anxious I can't even function,
Sure.
is because there's all this stuff inside. And
Sure.
so I do think too, to your point, in our society, there's just this adverse reaction to emotional pain, adverse reaction to big feelings,
Yeah.
adverse reaction to facing things. And it's so problematic because people end up staying in a lot of bondage
Yes.
because they don't realize that there's actually another side.
Yes. Yeah. It becomes a powerlessness in it. We don't know what to do with it. We're not equipped. And so when you and I were, in our journey and I was getting mentored by you, part of the reality of my understanding was, can grief be teachable? Can there be effective forms of grieving? And what I realized was that while we all might grieve individually and personally, uniquely to our own story, we kind of get stuck in similar ways. And part of the teachability that comes with grief and effective grieving is recognizing that we were never taught how to grieve. Like we were never taught what to do with loss. We were never taught to process our emotions. We were never taught what to do with big feelings. We were never taught. And instead, we were actually taught the opposite. Like not only were we not taught, but we were taught to suppress emotions. We were taught to mask them. We were taught to replace heavy experiences with like ice cream and toys and a new puppy. And that translates as an adulthood, like for men, into cars and maybe extramarital affairs and bigger homes. When something bad happens, let's just go get something shiny and new. And so in some ways, the teaching process of grief is actually an empowering process. It takes away the disempowerment, the powerlessness that comes with when we have big feelings and adverse events that are happening in our life and we don't know what to do with it. And we just go back to what I know you've also called these emotional identity building blocks, the emotional blueprints or identity building blocks, right?
Yeah.
And, we sort of have like many adults out there in the world who are kind of like childlike emotional skills that needs an upgrade and needs a skill set of a development. And when I learned that I can teach that was when I started to really allow myself the confidence and the expression and the megaphone of social media to say, hey, this doesn't have to be the case. We can do something about our grief and our loss or something that feels absolutely life changing and overwhelming. We can do this. We can get through this. And not only that, we could actually heal in really powerful and effective ways and then also resource you for the rest of your life. Like your whole life, you're going to experience more loss. Like this will be effective for you forever.
Oh, absolutely. And there was a couple things coming to mind as you were talking. And one of them being, I love what you said too, that a lot of times we might, yeah, we all respond in our individual ways, but a lot of us have learned a lot of the wrong things. And so we have a lot of barriers, right? And we need that
Truth.
uncovered.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you, and I've probably mentioned this before, I remember sitting down with Russell one day, who co-wrote the Grief Recovery Handbook and was one of the founders. And he looked across the table at me and he said, Sandi, we are not in the grief business. And I was like, oh, that's interesting because it says grief on the handbook. And he said, we're in the unresolved grief business. He said, if people
Oh,
were taught properly and
oh,
and grieved their experiences real time, we wouldn't need things like grief recovery because we
yeah.
would be naturally grieving. We'd be
Yeah.
naturally processing and we wouldn't be carrying unresolved grief.
We'd be digesting in real time.
Yes.
We wouldn't have this
Yes.
emotional constipation, emotional indigestion, right?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. That is such beautiful word. And I might even go further. I would say that you and I, we're not in the grief business. Not only are we not in the unresolved grief business, we're actually in the joy business. We're in the aliveness business.
Yes.
Because unresolved grief is going to rob joy, energy, aliveness, and vitality, emotionally and otherwise, physiologically as well. We've talked about that. And so we're actually in the aliveness business. And that's how I reframe it in terms of it being a coaching practice, utilizing grief work as a way to maximize, optimize life in terms of goals and achievements and things that we want to accomplish till we look back on our life without those regrets. We look back on our life and be like, oh my God, I did this so well at an emotionally, spiritual, physiological level. Like I have a sense of completion when my life comes. I have a sense of completion when a family member passes away. I have a sense of like, oh yeah, I did a good job. I can literally be here in this moment and be in love, not in regret.
So beautifully said, because I feel like there's times when maybe on a show or on something, I'll hear the person say, I've been through this experience. And so now for the rest of my life, I'm going to be, it's going to basically ruin the rest of my life. And I, I feel this cringe inside when I hear that
Yeah,
because yes, I understand that there can be things that happen and our life feels altered, but we don't have to carry those things
right,
for the rest of our lives. We
right,
don't, to your point, it doesn't mean that we have to live a less than life, that we
right.
can't ever experience joy, that we can't ever experience life again. And
Yeah,
I'm sad because I feel like those are people that don't really understand the nature of grieving and grief and really realizing that you can do that
yes,
and get on the other side of things and your
yes.
life can look totally different.
Yeah. I actually have a word for this that I've developed as I continue to write and share and do retreats and classes and coach. They call it the unscripted life. For so many of us, we're actually living a life on a train track that has a pretty clear trajectory. We're doing it very conventionally. We're kind of going with the flow of life of what everybody else is doing. But when grief hits or when life changing loss or a trauma comes in, we're jolted from that railway into a whole nother journey. And in some ways, it's at a different pace than everybody else. And it's in it sometimes a different trajectory. And I sometimes feel that the loss behind the loss is the desire to go back to the way things were. And that restitution, that fight for that normalcy is one of those perpetuating grief, unresolved grief realities. And that face embrace release phenomenon is embracing the sense of, oh, life is different. How do I own the difference of what life is? It may not be the same. And for those who have really truly experienced like life changing loss and grief in these kind of levels, we often say that friends become strangers and strangers become friends. you know? We lose a little bit of a community in there because people can't hold us in our grief when it's 2 years later and 3 years later. And they're like, you're still talking about your grief. Haven't you moved on from there yet? Oh, your grief is really uncomfortable. You're kind of a downer. That's really painful. That's like really hurtful when it's like the holiday season and you want to bring a picture of your loved one, your child into the experience. And everybody's like, we really want to have a joyous experience. We don't want to bring in this heaviness. That's really rejecting to your life experience. And so, this jolting to this new railway of life, this new trajectory, is a little bit unscripted. And that trajectory or that conventional or that foundation about how we were living life is also a part of our life, an intangible loss that's existing. And how we embrace that unscripted piece there actually is a big part of really joy-based grief work. And it's an important concept. And in actuality, in the grief work I do with my clients, this is actually the biggest component around the grief. It's not the past, it's not just the inner child, it's not just the unresolved losses. Those we can digest, those are big things. But living this sort of unscripted, this sort of unknown, this uncertain reality, this shifted from everybody else or that normalcy of what we've known, and integrating joy, because joy is right there in that. Grief is not meant to solely be a punishment. It's not meant to solely be a life sentence, imprisonment. There is an opportunity and some unveiling in there. And so I've kind of coined this phrase of the unscripted life as an indication that we can live not beyond loss, but with loss, and be a grief informed reality that's not absence of joy or aliveness or vitality, but with it even more so, because loss and grief have been part of our life.
I love the way you said that. I love this idea of unscripted. And I had so many thoughts just as you were even talking. I think about, even in my own story, as you know, there was so much that happened as a child, and all of this abuse and all this stuff, and then the time of speaking up, and then going back and forth. Am I like part of the family? Am I not? What do I need to do to be part of the family? Oh yeah, no, that's not going to work.
Yes.
And then really just stepping out and going, no, this is the truth. I'm going to stay in the truth.
Yes.
And I'm going to live this story. And
Yes.
it's opposite of what my family has chosen.
Yes.
And so there's losses in that, right? Because there's the loss of family, the loss of community, the loss of what people traditionally have as a family unit. And then stepping out into this real unknown. And so I've never thought of that kind of framework, of that unscripted life, but you're so right on. It's so unscripted. It's so different.
Yeah. And it becomes a real journey with fear, actually, like that uncertainty that we spoke about. And so there's a courage that we lean into it, which is why it's so hard for so many people, or why we don't normally have normal conversations about this. And so, I know we're coming to the end of our conversation here. And so for your listeners around this big topic around grief, I really just want to give a virtual hug to everybody in a compassionate and loving and tender way. This is not easy. And this work is probably like the hardest things that we've ever had to do. And the way that we are growing within ourselves is like an expanded self-concept. We are growing beyond what we might have ever known or thought that we would ever be. And in that courageous facing and embracing, there might be actually this beauty, this poetry, this phenomenal amount of joy and aliveness that might not have ever actually touched your heart even before your loss, that might come through for you. Like perhaps for me and you, Sandi, that has come through. Like the joy that I experience is like, oh my God, I didn't even think that I could experience this much amount of love and joy in my life. Like it kind of freaks me out a little bit, And I say, tender hearts, tender love, big hugs, compassionate to this experience. And, reach out. Like there are skills and techniques and ways to do this. Like this stuff does not have to be done alone. And so, yeah, thank you, Sandi, for this phenomenal conversation.
I have loved this conversation. I feel like in the future, we're going to have another one because there's so much to talk about. It's so much fun. But I just want to let everybody know, I will make sure there are ways for you to connect with AmarAtma if you're interested in, what he does, what he offers. He's amazing and just gives language to things, I feel like, in such a special way. I feel like it's language that it's so deep, but I can grab it. That's what I absolutely love. So thank you with all my heart. Thank you for being on today. This was amazing.
Thank you, Sandi, for the invitation. So much love to you and to everybody else out there, and very much looking forward to connecting with you all.